Against the backdrop of World War II, the area of Bengal experienced a famine that claimed the lives of anywhere between 2 and 5 million people. Whilst the region had historically suffered from famine, the famine of 1943 remains in infamy due to the myriad of natural causes and the role of the British colonial powers and war cabinet. Even to this day, there is a debate as to where the majority of the blame ought to fall. In today's video, we will briefly cover the situation before the 1943 famine, give an introduction into what is seen as the major causes and the consequences for the region. Bengal was part of the British Raj, the name given to the land controlled by the British Empire, which is now modern-day India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. As stated, the people of Bengal were no stranger to famine. There are recorded famines as far back as 1770, and evidence of famines even further back. The agricultural workers of Bengal tended to live off near starvation levels of food. The major crop was rice, which accounted for 3/4 of their diet, and of this rice, most would be harvested from the third and final crop in the winter. Diets would be supplemented with wheat from Burma and fish wherever possible, but overall, the rural poor diet of Bengal were often to the brink of famine. What's more, there was very little investment into improving the farming practices, which resulted in crop yields stagnating. There was little to no irrigation or means of pumping water, meaning crops depended on rainy seasons. This meant that to avoid famine, the government would need to monitor the situation, the climate, and respond appropriately, with food stores ready and aid if needed. An example of a potential famine that was well-handled can be seen in 1873. A poor rainy season and a drought resulted in a potentially devastating famine. However, the colonial powers and Christian missionaries sensed an opportunity to convert. They opened their coffers and purchased wheat from Burma, even purchasing far more than what was required to avert disaster. Due to quick action and governmental assistance, there were very few famine-related deaths. Despite this, those who conducted relief were chastised for their wasteful expenses and for interfering with the free markets. This in turn resulted in the British government establishing a famine relief policy that focused on minimal intervention. Between 1897 and 1942, there were no major famines in Bengal, in part to the lessons learned and from policies adapting to better avoid disaster. But this would soon change in March of 1942, and the Japanese invasion of Burma. With Burma captured, around 500,000 refugees fled to Bengal, whilst the British enacted a scorched earth policy, with infrastructure and supplies destroyed. This would also result in around 50,000 boats being destroyed, in a bid to further hinder the Imperial Japanese Army. Many of these smaller boats were vital for the transport of farm labourers and to bring produce to market, as well as for fishermen who were now left destitute. Attacks from the Imperial Japanese forces resulted in around 100,000 tons of shipping being sunk in the Bay of Bengal by April of 1942, with the British unable to mount a meaningful response and to protect their much-needed supplies. As the British Empire prepared for the invasion of India, Bengal and in particular Calcutta became a standing ground for war, with thousands of Allied soldiers braced for impending conflict. Manufacturing of arms and uniforms deemed vital to the war effort shifted from Burma to Bengal. This shift towards the needs of the war resulted in inflation, notably the price of grain. Money was printed, which enabled some in the cities to buy stockpiles of food, whilst many in the rural areas could barely afford to live. As food prices rose, the government of Bengal and the Chamber of Commerce implemented a prioritization of food. Those working in industries deemed vital to the war effort, such as manufacturing, textiles, and those working for the government, would be part paid in rice and receive access to cheap food. These policies tended to only benefit those working in and around Calcutta. Those working out in the rural areas were largely unaffected by this level of support. Without the imports of grain from Burma and without access to fish to supplement the diets of the agricultural workers, the demand and price for rice continued to rise. The colonial authorities did attempt to establish price fixing, but this only resulted in black marketeering of what surpluses were available. And if the situation was not bad enough, in October of 1942, Bengal was hit by a cyclone, and that cyclone brought with it a series of storms. These landed in the agricultural areas and resulted in the deaths of an estimated 15,000 people. Homes were destroyed and diseases such as dysentery ravaged the affected areas. The vital winter rice crops too were blighted by brown spot, a fungal infection that rendered much of the harvest inedible. Around this time, some in positions of power began to warn or lobby for aid to be sent to Bengal. Notable examples include the Prime Minister of Bengal, Fazal Huq. He warned that famine was becoming a real possibility. Victor Hope, the Viceroy of India, requested further food to ensure that there was enough for the soldiers stationed in Bengal. Despite the signs of an impending famine, 70,000 tons of rice were nevertheless exported from India in the first half of 1943. For the rural workers, the price of a bag of rice only grew from 0.27 rupees in January of 1943 to 0.78 rupees in May of 1943. All the while for the rural poor, daily wages stagnated at around 0.5 rupees, not able to cover even a single bag of rice. By March of 1943, those in the rural areas had exhausted all they could spare and survived as long as they could. Families resorted to selling everything they owned before stripping and selling the walls, doors, and roofs of their homes. All this to purchase enough rice to make a thin gruel. Eventually, the land itself was sold, often to benefit the landlords who capitalized on the catastrophe. When the starving had nothing left to sell, the women would sell their bodies, men would leave their families and hope to find work wherever possible, and there were even cases of children being sold. Starvation soon turned to anger. The landlords who were thriving would find themselves subject to a hungry mob, demanding access to their stockpiled food. Those landlords who did not comply would find themselves mutilated. Often, their faces would be burned. Eventually, those starving in the rural areas would make their way to the towns and cities, in a bid to beg, seek some level of organized aid, or to find work in the British Army. Thousands migrated to Calcutta, with many of them dying on the way and their bones littering the roads. Those who made it to the cities such as Calcutta did stand a chance of survival, but for many it was at a steep cost. Prostitution of young girls was commonplace, as was children sold or stolen into servitude. It is difficult to put into words what fate befell anywhere from 2 to 5 million men, women and children. There are many photographs of the victims of the Bengal famine available on the internet, many of which are incredibly distressing and not suitable for YouTube. My own words fall short of describing just how emaciated the people of Bengal became. Should you wish to look into this further, please be prepared. As thousands died in the streets of Calcutta, the removal of bodies became a growing problem. Those that were not buried or burned in the overwhelmed crematorium and graveyards would rot where they fell, or would be feasted upon by jackals and vultures. Diseases such as cholera, malaria and smallpox took hold and would ravage the weakened population. Even when a bountiful harvest in October of 1943 offered some relief, the deaths to disease did not reduce until December of 1943, with such levels returning to normal not until July of 1944. The reason why the tragic events of the Bengal Famine of 1943 remain contentious is the debate as the level of responsibility the British government should bear for the deaths. Famines are often a mixture of natural and man-made causes. This can be seen best in our video on the Irish potato famine. Many historians and researchers have plunged into the records, memos, and scientific data to establish what is truly responsible. In 1945, the Famine Inquiry Commission presented its reports as to the causes of the Bengal famine. It was set up by the colonial authorities to look into the causes of the famine, but its creation had some opposition, notably from the Secretary of State for India, Leopold Amery. The commission attributed the cause mainly to the cyclone, the brown spot fungus, and population growth. It paid little relevance to the inflation or the distribution policies of the British authorities. The Indian economist Amartya Sen, who survived the famine, attributes the causes as man-made, namely brought on by the policies of the colonial powers. He points to the fact that the harvests were lower in 1941, yet no famine occurred at this point. Sen points to the requisition of food by the state. The fact prices for food skyrocketed, yet little opportunity for those affected in the rural areas to escape starvation. Sen also asserted that famines do not occur in functioning democracies, as those in power respond better to the needs of those they serve and represent. A recent report released in 2019 highlighted that drought and a lack of moisture in the soil did not play a part in causing the famine. 150 years of drought data were analysed and found that levels during the years 1942 and 1943 were not of a level that could be deemed a drought, and instead lay the blame at the policy decisions of the British authorities, and in particular at Winston Churchill's feet. Churchill's views on the Indian people are often pointed as to the reasons for his actions during the Bengal Famine. Churchill referred to them as a beastly people, and is quoted as asking whether Gandhi had perished in the famine. He also said that it would be a poor endeavour to send food, as the Indian population just breed like rabbits. One key criticism is that an offer of wheat from Canada was rejected by Churchill, and that available wheat from Australia was not given the necessary shipping to help those starving in Bengal. The counterpoint is that around this time, newly liberated Italy was receiving aid, that shipping was needed in the Balkans, and that plans were being made for the Normandy D-Day landings. All focus was to be towards this vital operation. It is not hard to see how the Bengal Famine of 1943 has become politically charged, with many different interpretations for the causes. It is, however, difficult to ignore some factors. It very much seemed that whilst the famines had been brought under control in Bengal for at least 40 years, those who worked on the lands lived on the edge of starvation, with very little infrastructure or investment to better avoid famines. The onset of World War II and the loss of Burmese imports tipped the balance into food shortages being an issue, only exacerbated by the fungus and cyclone. It is also hard to ignore the policies of the colonial powers that resulted in prices spiking and the lack of aid delivered to the rural areas of Bengal. It is also important to note that shipping from Australia en route to the likes of Italy and Greece would pass through the Indian Ocean, not stopping on the way to deliver the much needed food. It is often asserted that because this famine took place during the Second World War, no meaningful response could be mounted. It is all but certain that hunger and the risk of famine and disease could strike anywhere in the world at such time. It is also difficult to ignore Churchill's hostility towards the people of Bengal. Churchill wrote much about the Second World War, but one key event is missing from his many volumes: the Bengal Famine. This video is but an introduction to the Bengal Famine, and one that will hopefully encourage you to think about the Second World War a little differently. It is estimated that approximately 4% of the world's population perished as a result of the Second World War. It is hard to ignore those servicemen and women who died as a result, yet we ought to also remember the civilian populations who perished during this time, and those who were slaughtered by means of genocide, such as the victims of the Bengal Famine. Whether you conclude it was malice, a series of unfortunate events, or a mixture, I hope you take the time to remember those who perished in the most heartbreaking of ways imaginable.